I want to introduce Colleen. Colleen T. Reese is a senior content strategist at Think Company. She has a decade of experience that runs the gamut from small consumer sites to enterprise level applications. Prior to working at Think Company, Colleen specialized in content strategy for food and hospitality brands, as well as higher education and software. In her spare time, Colleen is a musician and a gamer. She enjoys reading and is writing her own space-themed RPG game. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce all of you to Colleen. So let me get out of my presentation mode here. And hello, Colleen.
Hey, everyone. So I'm also going to put my closed captionings on here. As Phil mentioned, my name is Colleen T. Reese. I'm a senior content strategist here at Think Company. And today we're going to talk a little bit about decentralized content. And so I think it would be helpful if we started with a little bit of terms and definitions, because especially if we're looking at online resources, we can hear a lot of different terms for the same thing, especially when we start thinking about how content relates to things like content management systems, like WordPress or Drupal, and etc. So put short, decentralized content is really when content or components of content are distributed in multiple places. And we're going to talk about decentralized content from two different perspectives. We'll talk about the content itself, and we'll also talk about it from a content ops perspective. And so content ops is really just content operations. And so at the highest level, this refers to the people and systems and processes that support content creation, governance, and delivery. And there are some really kind of common elements of content ops. And we'll focus a lot more on operations and management today, because we really want to think about how the way that we do content work can really create better, more usable experiences, both for users and for the people that we work with to create and manage and assess content. And so some of those elements include things like content. So we'll look at the structures and how we organize content. Other elements of operations are really people. So, I kind of make a joke that 90% of the job of a content strategist is really just having conversations with people. And then, of course, there are systems. And systems are the things that support both the content and the people that it needs to serve. So when we think of systems, we think of the technology that supports content, and also just kind of the combination of content and people and how they work together. So today really is going to be kind of an introductory level to decentralized content management and content strategy. And I think it's good to start with kind of what we already know and what's going on right now in terms of how people manage content and how content progresses throughout different kinds of organizations. And what we know now is that content management systems, or CMSs, and technology are already kind of positioned to enable really great and impactful content distribution. So we can create content once and distribute it at scale pretty efficiently right now. But we're also creating a lot of different content. And so depending on the kind of team that you're on, you may be producing a lot of articles. If you are a content professional who works kind of more in a UX position, you may be creating a lot of things like micro copy for forms or helping with UX writing. And so for that reason, roles and responsibilities when it comes to content management can sometimes be unclear. We work with a lot of different teams. We work across a lot of different experiences, but actual dedicated content teams are still often very small or siloed. And so we struggle to keep up with demand. And so there are a lot of different challenges But I think when we kind of boil things down, there's one really interesting challenge when it comes to content operations. So we have to ask ourselves what really is kind of the primary problem that we're trying to solve when we think about developing a new way of thinking when it comes to how content is moved, from one team to another or from one stage to another. And the way that I explain this in terms of the primary issue that we often contend with as content professionals is that we still bias very heavily around the idea that content teams are built for the sole purpose of delivering content. More often than not, when we talk about content operations, we think about how content progresses through publishing workflows. So the starting point is really around planning and ideation, and the end point is when that content is deployed or published in some way, which is really important, but it's also a very limited view, both in terms of what the goal of content really is and how content teams can go about supporting both business goals and the goals that content needs to support. And to start unlocking how this bias formed, we can do a little bit of a very recent history lesson. And so if we go back to the 1990s, we can really see how this idea that content teams should be measured by and that content operations should be kind of measured by how much content we're producing, how quickly we're producing that content, and the manner in which it gets published. So if you're my age or older, you were probably exposed to this phrase at some point, content is king. And back in the early 2000 and 2010s, this was really big. But the phrase actually originates from an essay from Bill Gates called Content is King. And so he and a lot of the people who work at Microsoft were starting to think about, the future of essentially the internet. And they really started to predict the role that content would play. And to their credit, they had a really sophisticated idea of what content is and who would eventually have a hand in shaping that content and therefore kind of shaping the internet. And what's interesting here is that if we look at this quote, they really kind of view content as more than just blogs or articles or long form written content. And they even consider something like software to be an important form of content. And they also started to predict that everyone would eventually have a hand in producing content on the internet. And at some point, we started to think about the content is king phrase in a very different way. So this is a screen capture of Google search results in 2010 for the whole year. And so we see that we're still kind of talking about this content is king thing, and we have this obsession with content. And we also start to see how technology and how the goals of content organizations started to shape even what we considered to be content and how we set goals for that. And so if you remember around 2010, this is when we started to talk about content really kind of in the context of social media. And that's because at that time, social media was starting to get really serious about sustaining and producing both kind of an advertising model and also becoming a really attractive distribution channel for content providers. And so there was this sudden mad dash to kind of feed this machine. And so we looked to content teams to produce a really massive scale of content in a really efficient manner. And we can even see, if we're not even thinking about something like social media, we can even see if we look at like an old homepage from the New York Times, just the level, like sheer volume and level of content that was being produced around this time. And this is really when this bias around what the goal of content operations starts to form. This is a really extreme example, of course, because not every business is going to provide the same volume of content as a news organization, for example, but it really illustrates just how much content users were being exposed to at the time. And with this massive scale of content to contend with, we really had to think more about the kind of technology that would help us manage and distribute that content, especially to platforms like social media. And so at this time, we were looking at content management systems and asking them to take content that we produced for websites and very quickly repurpose them and distribute them to social media. And so this is when we started seeing things like content automation start to grow up. And at the same time, all of this chaos kind of came to a head. I think it's Newton's third law that says, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And I really do think that Christina Halvorson's content strategy for the web, which came out around the same time as this 2010s content chaos that we're talking about, and her book really started a conversation around what digital content can do for businesses. And that really helped us to start thinking more intentionally about the content that we were creating. And I think it also started it was important for two different reasons. One, it illustrated what else content professionals can bring to the table. But it also started to help us expand our ideas about what content is and can be. And so even when we think back to this kind of 2000 and teens content era, we were producing a lot of content, and it was often in the form of like a blog. Like the gold standard of content marketing was kind of making sure that your business's website had a blog. And we started to think about content in that frame. So how do we produce this kind of like written form content? And when content strategy for the web came out, we started to look at content less as something like an article or a blog post that needed to be produced at scale, and a lot more as an information product. And so just quick warning, I'm going to show you today's homepage for the New York Times, not because I want to bring more news into our life, but just because I think it's a really great illustration of kind of what we're talking about here. So this is today's homepage for the New York Times. And I think when we start to look at what was happening at this kind of weird history lesson, you can start to see how even the way that we approached how we did the work started to inform much more usable and better experiences for users. So when we started to slow down and started to think about what else besides deploying content at scale should be considered in content strategy and also in content operations, the outcome is also benefited from that. And so here's kind of the side-by-side comparison of these two things. And aside from, the really obvious observation here, which is that there is significantly less content that the user is exposed to at once, we also start to see these little indications of how content is being treated as an information product and less as individual stories or individual articles. And so if you look at the top right of today's paper, there are things like the weather, there's a stock market ticker. We even see today's date on the top left here. And so we're starting to see how our idea of content can be expanded. And when we do start to do that, we also have to think about how that content is managed differently than something that's really self-contained and has a home like a blog post or an article. And if we agree on kind of Christina Halverson's content strategy for the web idea that, you know, there is more to content than creating a bunch of content, we also have to acknowledge the different types of content. And so, you know, to me, this is also content. The information products that are associated with, you know, an e-commerce page here, these are different forms of content, and the content needs to be structured, and it has to be useful on the website. It has to be distributed to social media. It has to be printable. There are all these different requirements for this content. And in order to start thinking about how we might manage content for our organizations, we need to understand these information products at a really deep level. And so before we can determine something like a content management model, we need to understand the actual content model. And a content model it's a map, and it maps the structural and semantic relationship of interconnected content across an experience or multiple experiences. Content models can take lots of different forms. Sometimes they come in the form of a spreadsheet. Sometimes they're diagrams. Sometimes they're Word documents. However, all content models include some level of categorical or hierarchical organization, as well as specifics regarding the informational requirements of different kinds of content. And so if we were thinking about the Nike example I just showed, you know, sweaters might be a content type. And as we start to map that out, we think about what do people need to know about this information? And then how do we help take that information from a planning point all the way through to a maintenance and archival standpoint. And we organize content models hierarchically, so basically from greatest to smallest, into three primary categories. And so the largest and kind of broadest category of organization within a content model is called a content type. And those can be as broad as something like people, or as specific as something like books or sweaters. It really depends on the specification of the content itself. Within each content type are components. And so these are those small informational products that make up content. And so one example of a component might be, say we have a content type called people. A component might be a name or a credential. And then each component has fields. And fields are essentially a representation of how that content needs to be ingested by, you know, whatever our internal distribution mechanisms are. So most typically that's going to be something like a CMS. And so to give you an example of what a content model looks like, we can look at something like this. So if we imagine for a moment that we are some kind of online bookstore, we would create a content model that helps us understand the relationship between different kinds of content. And so we've identified here that maybe we have books as a content type, we have articles as a content type, and authors as a content type. And if we follow books as the content type here, those books have titles, they have cover images, they have author names associated with them, they have descriptions, they have reviews, prices, etc. Cover images are a component that are made up of certain fields in a CMS. And so those fields might be something like a file name, an image title, or alt text. And so all we're doing here is taking content and breaking it down to its smallest form from its greatest form. And similarly to most systems, there are a couple different ways that we can approach the content model itself. So this example that I'm showing you is actually an example of a centralized content model. So despite the fact that each one of these content types is perhaps sharing a little bit from another, they're really connected, they're not necessarily considered, this isn't a decentralized content model. In this case, we could probably assume that this particular model represents something like a website. And so the content itself is distributed within a self-contained experience. It still may get shared to social media, for example, but how we're managing the content is kind of self-contained in this one experience here. If we add some additional complexity to this model and say we have some kind of company intranet, which is a separate entity on its own, it's a separate experience, a separate property, we can start to see how something like a decentralized content model works. And so here we have the bookstore, the online bookstore, which is separate from the actual intranet. But we may, as content or content stakeholders and owners, look at this and say, hey, we already produced this content around books, and we want employees to be able to know when a new book is available, for example, and we don't want to just copy and paste information from one site to another. And so we'll start to develop governance and systems around how to support that goal of creating once and publishing in multiple experiences. And usually that's facilitated by a specific type of CMS, and they're called headless or decoupled CMSs. And what those allow us to do is, one, create content that is agnostic of the front end presentation. And it also gives us a little bit more flexibility to play with other CMSs. And so when we add the intranet, we start to see how content itself can start to become decentralized. So the content here, or components of this content, are being distributed across multiple properties or experiences. So rather than being in a self-contained, centralized location, we're going to kind of let this content live in other areas. And so the next question is really around, how does our model of content, or how do content models inform our operations? And I think this is a really important distinction, because content models don't just represent content. Content models represent information and people. And so when we think back to this example of the bookstore and the intranet, there's probably a separate intranet team. And they have content professionals on their team, and they manage content a certain way, they deploy the content a certain way. And so when we look at the job of a content model, it's not just to represent how content is connected or how it relates to one another. It also explains to us who needs to be involved in this content. So the more we can answer questions like, how does the content need to be organized and distributed to the user or many users? And then how does it need to be organized or distributed to our other content stakeholders or team members? We can start to get a sense of the different teams that may need to be involved in our content management. And we'll start to see a little bit more of that people aspect. Similarly to content models, there are different ways that we can approach content management. And so this starts to speak a little bit more to the people aspect of content management. And like content itself, content management can be approached in a centralized or decentralized way. So centralized teams or centralized content management ops, most likely there is kind of a central team or a central person. And that central team, whether they be designers, content editors, et cetera, kind of approves and manages and administers content on behalf of other content owners and creators. In a decentralized content management system, the central team or designing team will essentially create basic structures. And that might be in the way of some kind of like page template or outline. And they'll create basic structures. And then they will allow content stakeholders to publish content with little or no oversight from the central team. So there's none of that kind of central approval. And to put this kind of in like real world context, this is really common for content experiences that rely on user inputs like wikis or community-based platforms where, you know, people can kind of publish at will. They're still monitored in some capacity, but there's less of that approval structure there. In the real world, you know, when we're not thinking about things just from a purely theoretical standpoint, we're going to find that the most common version of content management styles or content management ops is really a hybrid of both. And so in these hybrid style content management ops, there's a central team that approves and publishes maybe specific kinds of content and allows content creators to publish freely elsewhere. So this is probably feels very familiar. This is where most of us kind of operate in. And while both management and model can both be approached from a centralized or decentralized way, it's not necessarily one-to-one. And so we'll find lots of examples of a centralized content model. So a website, for example, where things are fairly self-contained. You know, we're not talking about a pretty grand scale here. That still uses a decentralized content management process. So examples of this might be when content is highly regulated and needs to be reviewed by lots of different team members, or when content is highly specified. So technical content, things like that, where you're relying on subject matter experts to kind of author the content for you. And when we start to kind of layer in both the actual content itself and this people aspect of it, so how we manage the content, how we work with each other to deploy and deliver content, that really is what builds a system. But I think one question kind of remains, you know, whether or not your content lives on just a website or many websites or lots of subdomains or in different intranets. There's a question about like, why is understanding decentralized content so important? You know, why can't we just kind of stick with this centralized model and this central team? And the short answer for me is really that people need content to make sense of experiences. And so increasingly, we're going to see that content has to be distributed in lots of different places. And when we start to distribute that content in many different places, we need lots of help from lots of different people and technology. And in fact, I think this is really kind of the job of a content strategist, is to help people, including the people that you work with to co-author content with and to co-author your strategies with, is to help them make sense of this experience. And so we're still kind of in this centralized team focus. And so sometimes we have to think about what the role of traditionally centralized teams is going to be when we know that content is increasingly going to have to be distributed across many different experiences. And so when we think back to our friend here, the centralized content management team, what is their role when content is increasingly decentralized? And so what we can do as kind of dedicated content teams in a world where content is distributed and decentralized is really start to break down that bias of content as pure delivery systems. and the job of content professionals to focus on delivering content. And so the role of centralized teams is really going to evolve to think more about creating those structures that empower other people to get involved in the content process and the content approval process. And so that might include things like establishing content models and architecture. It might include things like setting the tone for content ops. And so if we don't agree that just getting content from A to B should be the goal of a content team, what are our content goals? And how do we create systems to support those goals? And then, of course, there are certainly exceptions to the decentralized kind of rule. There are information products and content that is always going to require centralized management and approval, especially if you work in any kind of industry where information is highly regulated. And then finally, rather than thinking about content delivery as the sole kind of KPI for content teams and really for content management, thinking about other activities like assessing content and content needs over time will really be kind of the role of these central teams. So what can you do today to kind of prepare for this decentralized world, both in terms of working well with other content teams and making sure that your content is distributed efficiently? I think it starts with having a lot of conversations. Sometimes when we talk about things like operations and workflows, we can fall into the habit of trying to optimize ourselves out of the equation. And we really saw that in some of this kind of like brief history lesson about how content goals really kind of shaped this like weird time in content where we were producing a bunch of really low quality content really quickly. And so it's important to remember that content is for people. And so it requires a lot of conversations with users and stakeholders. And I don't think that that's a particularly controversial thing to say. I think most content strategists would certainly agree with that. And so in terms of starting to get your team ready or even yourself ready for enabling more decentralized content management, what you can do is start to have some conversations. And we can start to ask questions about content. So what content do we have? What do users need? What does our business need? How much of that content do we currently have? Where does it live? Where does it need to go? And how can we help distribute content at a greater scale without creating redundancies or duplicative tasks? And then we can start to think about people. So who else in your organization creates, manages, or administers content? Some of the things that might immediately come to mind are developers, designers, other content editors. What do they need to know about how to create useful and beneficial content experiences? How do we want to work with other teams? So if we do want to partner up with another content team like an intranet team, what agreements can we make with that team about how we pass content between our two different experiences? How does it need to be structured? What do our users share in common? What don't they share in common? And then in lieu of things like traditional approvals, how might we assess content experiences over time? And I think answering that question is really going to help build, what is the foundation of your content management process going forward. Is we're not going to be able to sustain, and this was proven in this kind of like 2010s thing, we can't sustain these really small teams, being tasked with intaking and outputting these massive scales of content. And so if we're not going to follow this same kind of linear workflow, how are we going to ensure that the content that we're approving or monitoring are of a particular quality? And so in terms of this as kind of like an introductory conversation. I think some of these questions in particular will help you start to answer how you can start empowering other team members to get involved in the content process, and how you can start to democratize content and content strategy in your organization. And so I'm going to take a quick pause so that we can grab some questions. But I just wanted to say thanks for spending some time with me. Again, this is a kind of an intro level class, and we'd love some feedback on what some more specific topics for content strategy that we can go over. So.
Thanks, Colleen. So I'm going to give my closed captioning one more try. I was trying to test it out while you were over there doing the talk, and I couldn't get it to work. So let me see if I can get it to work. And if I can't, I might ask you to put up like your closing slide, and we can use yours instead. So give me 1 second to see if it's no, it's still not working on my side. So I don't know if there's a slide, Colleen, that you can throw up there so that if any folks need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there we go.
Excellent. Now let's see, is mine working in there as well?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. Okay, good. All right. So we have a few questions in Q&A. I actually have a whole bunch of questions myself that I generated while we were going through this, but I didn't sign up for this webinar, so I'll let them ask their questions first.
Sure.
They're all anonymous. It seems like a pretty shy crowd. So I'm just going to hit up their questions one by one as we go through. The one that was rated at the top was, can you give us some more examples of how decentralized content is shared across teams or experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, Phil, you mentioned in my bio that I have a little bit of experience working with higher education teams, and higher education teams are really great examples of how decentralized content can work or not work. And so when we think about the different even business units that make up something like a public university, for example, there are a lot of different people who create content for the same experience. So a great example of how different teams might produce content for the same experience and have to share content would be like college admissions. And so there could be a financial aid team who creates content around financial aid. There's an admissions team who actually goes through the process of like creating like tutorial content about how to apply. And then there are, of course, academic teams who manage content around course catalogs, who manage article content and things like that. And when you think about this from a user's perspective, their goal is to determine whether or not a certain school is right for them. And so they'll go to an admissions section, but they need content from all of those different teams to help solve or answer that question. And so all of those different teams are probably working with different content management systems. They're probably working on different content models. But when we start to approach this from a decentralized standpoint, what they have to do is essentially convene and make some agreements about, okay, we're all a part of kind of this content experience. Let's build a model that clearly documents the requirements for this particular experience. And then let's talk about how we can use process and technology to enable each one of those teams to distribute the content to that one location from all different types of technology.
That makes a lot of sense. And having worked on a few higher ed projects myself, I feel like the creation of a unified content model, or at least approaching that unified content model, helps in those situations where different organizations may feel like they have domain over the same thing. Mm-hmm. You say, you talk about the difference between admissions and financial aid. Like there's these areas that kind of overlap between those two areas. And I can see how if they if at least you're contributing to a singular content model or using a singular content model, that helps alleviate some of the conflict that you end up getting between two different organizations that are trying to contribute the same, meet the same goal.
Yeah. And I think we'll find it's really common to look at, a content model and see that the content is organized based on how the business operates. When we look at a lot of content that hasn't been assessed in a while, it's typically organized to enable individual teams to meet their goal of producing and delivering content. And so that's how we wind up with really fragmented experiences, like not having financial aid content in admissions. It's over here in a separate subdomain, or in a different application if we're talking about mobile applications or knowledge bases, for example. And so the role of centralized teams, of like marketing teams, for example, or communications teams, or specifically content teams, is really to make sure that the process that they are enabling allows these other teams to kind of have an equal hand in that unifying experience.
Yep. Yeah, and I feel like the single largest problem that any good experience design or content strategy organization is trying to solve for any of their clients is this notion that they structure things around their own internal structures as opposed to around what the user needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what you're describing, right? That if you create a user-centered content model, then the likelihood of you creating a website or an application or a tool or whatever that reflects your structure as opposed to the needs of the user is greatly reduced.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Yeah.
So the next question, again, this is another anonymous question. What are some examples of how you might start to organize roles and responsibilities for content across multiple teams?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really related to one of the questions I was going to ask. So I'm glad that it was there at the top.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think that how we treat roles and responsibilities necessarily changes that much in a decentralized model. So there are still going to be people who are responsible for planning content. There are still going to be people who are responsible for producing content, and there are still going to be people who are responsible for approving and administering that content. And so when we talk about how to approach doing that with a lot of different teams, I certainly don't want to oversimplify things, but sitting down and having conversations about what each one of those teams needs out of this experience. So having interviews with other teams about how they create and distribute content, especially from the perspective of like technology stakeholders, is really important, and is probably the first and the most important step that people can take towards building a management model that includes all of those teams.
Do you think, so you put them in these categories of planning, producing, and approving or administering. I think that's a great way of looking at it. Do you think that changes when you go from a centralized model to a decentralized model, or do you think that both of those models still need people fulfilling those roles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you still need people to be in different roles. I think where the real challenge with decentralized content comes to play is that your role will change depending on the content that you are managing. And so in a decentralized model, you may be the approver and administrator on a specific type of content, but that content may include components that were produced by another team. Or that come from another experience. And so your role as a content stakeholder in the process changes for that specific component. So you might not be an approver for that content. It is, pulled in automatically through API or something like that. or even just from a general governance perspective, you are no longer the approver of that content. And so there's no kind of like approval purity anymore, which is what makes operations for content really difficult, because we're trying to take content that this team has the constitution to approve and this team does not.
Yeah, it's interesting because I draw so many parallels, and one of my questions later on, we'll talk about this, but I draw so many parallels between design and content strategy work, and to me this is the same challenge a lot of organizations that have decentralized design systems encounter, where there are some, there are components in your design system that you don't have domain over. It's just that that sidebar is going to be that sidebar and you're stuck with it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all very similar. So that's great. Okay, let's go to the next question. What are some examples of CMSs or other technologies that enable decentralized content?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So for CMSs, any CMS that is headless or decoupled is going to better enable decentralized content. And headless or decoupled just means that it is agnostic of the front end presentation. And so what you input into the CMS does not necessarily equal what the user will see or how it is presented in a design system. But these CMSs are also better enabled to share content between different technology systems because they can ingest and distribute content through APIs. And you're just not going to get that with a traditional or coupled CMS. And examples of those is like Drupal is a decoupled or headless CMS. Some versions of WordPress are decoupled or headless. Joomla, I think, is one of them.
That's great, and that's a great explanation of that, because I think I've heard, I hear the term headless CMS all the time, and then I think a lot of people don't have they don't want to be the one to ask, like, what is that? What's the difference between that and the other thing? But you described it really well. So let's go to the next question from that then. What do I do if everything needs to be approved by a regulatory or a legal review board? And this is very closely related to a question that I was going to ask in the same regard of, like, what do you see as the differences between like highly regulated environments and non?
Yeah, I think so. In those cases, there's still a question of scaling content operations. So the mandate is not going to go away that we have to produce content efficiently and at scale. So experiences need content, and so we need content professionals to create content or to manage content. In highly regulated environments where content needs to go through a system of legal approvals, for example, or other regulatory reviews, I think the best thing to do is to really take on kind of that hybrid management model. And so if you can get legal teams to approve a structure and make a commitment that the content that is produced within that structure will be predictable, you won't be able, there's no getting around receiving that legal approval, but you will have, a better relationship with the people who, like the lawyers and the people who do your regulatory reviews, and you can start to cut that time down a little bit versus, recreating the wheel every time you have to publish a new page, create a new content experience, something like that.
That's great. Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I remember years ago working in the pharmaceutical industry and just really trying to get all the different brands to agree on, the language for that footer that appears on every pharmaceutical page. And back then it was the review teams were begging for it. They were like, every time someone hands us a different, we call it the ISI at the time, the important safety information. Every time another website is launched for this product and they've recreated a new ISI tray. It's just driving us insane. And it was about how they interacted with that tray, but also how the content was managed. So I've seen a lot of different models. Some things Think Company has done, some things other organizations have done, where, you know, they can centralize all of that stuff. So there's one review and approval board for all of the sort of legal language that needs to be put out there, and you as the brand really don't have a domain over that anymore. And then what it allows to do is it provides the people who are generating the unique content for that page or that tool or whatever to focus on the stuff that they really want to be focusing on. And sometimes it's a struggle to wrestle that out of their hands, to say like, hey, this legal stuff, don't worry about that. We got that taken care of. It's living in a centralized place.
Mm-hmm.
It's helping the review committees so that they don't have to spend their time reviewing the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
You know, it benefits everyone, but it's like asking people to give up control sometimes is a little bit of a challenge. So
Yeah. And I mean, that's the crux of moving from a centralized model to a decentralized model, is finding the locus of control when it comes to content, and then letting other people play with it, and like giving it away and empowering others to be in charge.
yeah, and I think it's around, like, you know, showing empathy for the people who have to review the content as well. Like
Mm-hmm.
often people look at those legal and regulatory review meetings with their, you know, whether they're in financial services or healthcare or whatever, they look at that as a battle. And it's really, you know, the people who are reviewing it for a legal perspective or medical perspective or SEC compliance or any of that kind of stuff, like, they're doing their job.
Mm-hmm.
And their job is really high pressure. If the organization gets fined by the SEC or the FDA or something like that, they will lose their jobs.
Yeah.
Whereas if you forgot to put a, you know, an apostrophe, someone's just going to say, edit your content better, you know?
Yeah. And the job of the centralized team is really to lock that down and automate it as much as they can, so that the unique or decentralized content that is starting to affect, you know, this like predictable model, it is less of a impacts the overall experience less.
Absolutely. Sorry, I keep hitting the mute button because someone's vacuuming on the other side of this door. So, okay, let's go to the next question. What tools are most often used for content creation at the point of creation that will ensure the content is tagged or identified in a way to make it more intelligent, to improve management and delivery?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big one. um,
Yeah, that's a huge question. I am of the opinion, and it's an unpopular opinion because there is certain risk associated with this. So if we're talking about ensuring that content is properly tagged so that it can operate in a decentralized system, I think people are always going to default to things like Word documents, or you know, whatever notes or pen to paper is most helpful to them. Or if you're working on UX writing, you're going to do a bit of the creation process in something like a prototype. But if push comes to shove and I have to answer the question, what is the best way to create content in order to do what you're describing, my answer is directly in the CMS. I think so long as you can structure and configure a CMS so that approval pathways are clear and protected, the more people that can create content in the CMS and can access the CMS, the better.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think another, I mean, on the tagging side of this that helps make these systems more intelligent, I think a really important thing is to really figure out what that essentially what the hierarchy and taxonomy of tags
Mm-hmm.
are, you know, prior to opening it up to the crowd. And that doesn't mean that taxonomy is always going to be the same. You know, you're always going to add to it or refine it,
Mm-hmm.
which requires you again to go back to old content and figure out, you know, what the changes to the taxonomy mean to that old content. But you know, trying to figure out a tagging system on the fly is just not is not going to help you at all.
Yeah. And a content model will help to illuminate some of that taxonomy. I mean, the example that we looked at today was purely kind of like a high level, like widgety example. But your content model should be fairly complex and include things like what tags are even associated with this content, so that when it comes time to approach things like taxonomy, we've already done the work of determining what are the informational requirements for this content.
Yeah, yeah, that is really important. Hey, we're rounding around 4 o'clock, so just if anybody does have to drop, we appreciate it. We're still going to keep going until we exhaust all these questions, and I exhaust my questions too. If anybody's interested in hearing me ask them, although we're hitting most of them. But thank you for joining. If you have to drop off, and there's some information in the chat around just surveys and things like that, and you'll get that also in a follow-up email through the email address that you signed up for the webinar. So on to the next question. How do you approach a situation where content is very decentralized in its distribution because the nature of that content is so different? Example, streaming video versus books. But the customer wants to see and experience everything you as a company offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. um, I think a really similar, a good analogy might actually be, and I use Nike as kind of an example, is e-commerce in general. And so when we think about how we navigate something like an Amazon as a user, there's no way for Amazon to really truly anticipate the entire possibility of how people might prioritize certain information. And so that's how we wind up with these like massive kind of filtering lists, and they're less hierarchical and more categorical. And so while that is a daunting task, I think when we are considering something like books versus video, we can, not to repeat, but we can look at our content model and say, first, how does this content relate or not relate to each other? Because can this content appear in the same place? Can it not? And then how is it prioritized from the user's perspective? So we have to create some sense of hierarchy of information, or categorization of information, because even if we can't say books are more important than videos, we still need to be able to map out in order to say, like, how do we handle this content from a management perspective? We still have to map out the two different categories, what content is contained within those categories, and then do the work of mapping out what is the actual relationship between these two categories of content. And you might find that there is no relationship to them, in which case the content may live separately, or it may not be as interconnected as we anticipated. But what you'll probably find is that there are certain very specific pieces of information that are related to one another. And so if, for example, we wanted to pull like video content, or we have to manage that content in some capacity, but we're books people, we would have to kind of sit down with our content model and say, exactly what information or content do we need about videos on this book's experience? And then sit down with the video team and say, hey, we need the file name, we need X, Y, and Z, and here's how we need you to deliver that content to us in terms of like format and structure. And here's how we're going to present that content to the user. Do you agree with this, or do you not agree with this?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to explain it, and I think you're highlighting the fact that it's not just a content challenge, it's a design challenge, and that's where when we talk about the end user's experience, they're experiencing both content and design at the same time, or the mechanisms that we created to deliver that content to them at the same time. So it does seem like you do need to create those content models around each of those two different content types, like books or streaming videos. Amazon's a great example. Like you may at first sit there and say, well, we still need a comprehensive content model between these two content types. We need to create those things. You can even create those things in isolation, but eventually some designer is going to come along and say, hey, if somebody searches for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and we're streaming it, and there's also a book, and by the way, there's, you know, a play you can buy and other things, then then it's sort of a design challenge to figure out how to compile all those things together. And that designer would not be able to achieve that challenge if they didn't have a content model to look at.
Yeah.
So, and you know, maybe the content model is a little more fungible that way, because you have to go in and manipulate it a little bit to address new challenges that come up, but that's fine.
Yeah. Another kind of like analogy for that could be like shoes and bags, you know, like looking at a leather shoe and a leather bag, but I've searched for bags and I've searched for shoes, but really the thing I'm looking for is leather. And so this underscores how important it is to determine kind of what is a content type. So what is the greatest level of categorization that you can apply to the content? And then how do these particular things fall under or not fall under that thing? So shoes and bags in this case would fall under kind of the leather category.
Got it. Yeah. Very interesting, fascinating. It's been a while since I worked in a retail, like an e-commerce or retail project, but like the thought of like I remember working on a women's retail site, and women could create their own collections, you know, and sort of be their own fashion designer, create collections and then share them. And it was this sort of idea to allow people to sort of what's that called when you're dressing other people, style. Where you can style other people, right? So you can share your collections and stuff like that, and just the idea that you're taking anything that's sold in the site and being able to put it all together. Even in that case, when you could create the collections, you actually couldn't bring fragrances in, even though that particular women's clothing store had a very extensive fragrance sub-site of their site. You know.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, here's the last question. What are some other goals besides output or efficiency that we can apply to content operations?
This is my favorite question so far, because I think it speaks to the role of content people, whether you're a content marketing person or a content strategist or somebody who designs content. But content is kind of like a partner to many. And so when we think about how we measure content and how we start breaking down that bias of the role of content in our organizations to kind of quickly deliver this content, we can start to look at how intentional content experiences support other measurements of success. So for example, content and UX are really natural partners. And so we can start to measure the kind of efficacy of our content operations by things like a reduction in abandoned tasks or a reduction in the time it takes to accomplish tasks. And then from a technology perspective, when we skip content strategy, I think and content management, the first people to inherit that kind of process debt are going to be developers. And those developers, especially if they administer or work on the CMS in some capacity or helping to build the thing, they're going to have to do this work of creating these structures and creating these connections between content. And so you can even start to develop metrics around your content operations by the reduction of developer time. Not that we want to optimize them like out of the equation, but more so that they have to inherit less of that structural like debt and that thinking.
Yeah, that you've answered a lot like around that just very big small question that was asked in there. That's great. Well, that exhausts all the other questions, and I also noticed that it looks like closed captioning died on your machine as well. So I think the tool that we're using is probably not as efficient. If you want to stop sharing your screen, I think I have one last question to ask, and this is kind of a loaded question. It's kind of big, but it's around this idea, and we touched on it a little bit. Like when you were going over sort of the questions that a content strategist asks in order to create, governance systems and content models and all of those things, I'm always struck by the fact that about 75% of what a content strategist is seeking out, a good design team is also seeking out as well. Like there's just so much overlap in those two Venn diagrams. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what a great relationship between design and content is, and maybe even like, do you see, no, Suzanne popped in for a second. Do you see, do you like, how much difference do you see between content and design?
That's the $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
I think that content and designers answer the same questions because depending on who is being tasked from an organizational perspective with answering these questions is oftentimes both of us. And so it's not uncommon or surprising to see content people ask the same questions as designers because we're really trying to do the same thing, which is, that phrase. I really think the job of content strategists and designers is to help people make sense of experiences. I think the difference is that a lot of content professionals have, because of this like content is king era, there's still this hidden like content being used to influence behaviors rather than respond to them and to like enable user behaviors. And so as we've matured content strategy as a discipline, there's been a really huge convergence between content and design. I think because design has been at a later stage of maturation than content has been until fairly recently. And so when it comes to kind of like divide and conquer those things, it becomes nearly impossible to determine whose job is it to identify how things are made at an organization, and how they should be made or how they should be organized. And so I'm often hesitant to say like this is the job of the content strategist and this is the job of the designer. But I think there are two different skill sets. And so when we're talking about extrapolating the greatest value between the two and making the most of that partnership, I think when we're talking about kind of like how things need to be organized and the structure of those things, I think that you'll find that content strategists are very well positioned to ask those questions. And then when it comes to how do we enable that, on the front end and through front end presentation, I think that's when designers and content strategists need to start having a conversation.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And it's like, I agree. It's really hard to figure out how to draw those concrete lines there. But I do think it's really important. I know as a designer, my entire career, I was always skeptical if someone came along and said, "Hey, we did all your research for you, so here it is. Just live with that, and don't go and ask people questions." And so I'm hesitant to ever walk into a situation where a designer is trying to do that with a content strategist. And I think the best work that I've ever seen done is when they're sort of going arm in arm, skipping down the emerald path on themselves together, and know how to work together on those things and be able to sort of ask those questions side by side. But you're right, when it comes to like the organization of the content and the structuring of it and stuff like that, it's best suited by the content strategist. And I think designers just appreciate being in the room when that's going on, when that conversation's happening. Well, this has been great. There are no more questions in Q&A. We still have a few participants that stayed, so I think we had a successful successful talk. And we're at about 4:16. So I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, Colleen, but if not, then we can wrap it up.
No, just thanks for having me.
Great. Well, for those of you who are still here, there is going to be and I closed my notes for this when I was trying to test out the CC, so I'm going to do this all by memory. But we have another workshop coming up next, or another webinar coming up next week. And there will be an email sent out with a recording of this if you want to share it with colleagues that you think should have come along. Any resources that we talked about in this meeting, in this webinar, any materials Colleen's put together to share with everyone will be in there. And thank you for attending, and we hope to see you at another webinar coming soon. Have a good night, everyone.